Greetings to you all, locally or internationally. I'm glad you can join us. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of Australia and the Torres Strait Islands and pay my respects to their elders in the past, the present, and those who are emerging. I also want to say that the Mental Health Foundation Australia and me personally are thinking very much at the moment of all of you who are adversely impacted by the virus pandemic, a perverse act of nature. Those who've lost loved ones and families in stress. But I also like to encourage you to think about the fact that from stress and challenge, we can actually grow. And I hope that you might all grow from this challenging experience as well. Now, if we could move to my PowerPoint presentation, thank you. The first slide. Well, in considering mental health, we have to think about what on earth is it? And I've got up here a bit of a definition. It's certainly a state of well-being, and it refers to our emotional, our psychological, and our spiritual health, and to how we feel about ourselves and how we adapt and function to the best of our ability in our relationships, in our families, in the workplace, at school and learning, and in the world around us. Mental health does determine how well we work, how well we socialise, how well we love, how well we play, and how well we are creative. So it's very pervasive, isn't it? And so important. It therefore impacts the intellectual, social, and economic capital of a community. And that's why our politicians must take it very seriously because it has such a profound impact on all aspects of our life and about the wealth, overall wealth and well-being of our nation, and in fact, of the global community. Next slide. So if that's mental health, what's mental illness? Well, mental illness implies that there's a disorder, there's a dysfunction, there's a problem. And that problem is with the mind and the brain and how it functions. And this dysfunction significantly interferes with our thinking, our emotional experiences, and impacts adversely our behaviour. Therefore, it can impact also adversely how we learn, our education, our work, our relationship with others, those we're close to and those we generally meet in day-to-day life, and adversely impacts our social life. And it can also adversely impact our physical health as well. So again, mental illness is a pervasive perturbation or trouble that human beings face. Now let's move on to the next slide. We're going today to talk about mental health in adolescents and young people. But mind you, mental health is an issue at all ages, from birth right through to the ends of our life. But today we're going to focus on young people. And I've already given an address in this mental health month about older young people. And today I'm going to focus particularly on younger adolescents, that is from about 12 years to 16 years. But we do know that about 1 in 4 young Australians in a 12-month period suffer from mental ill health, from clear and obvious dysfunction in their mental well-being. Now, unfortunately, under the stress of the pandemic restrictions, mental health of all of us, but particularly young people, is impacted even further. There are all sorts of prevalence figures being stated about the mental health of young people at this time of pandemic. I think we've got to wait a little while longer to be absolutely certain about those figures. but certainly it might be as many as 50% of young people are impacted in their mental health and well-being by this pandemic. But let's wait and see if that's actually the case. Whatever the case is, there's an increase in prevalence. Unfortunately, too, mental ill health can be associated with death by suicide. And at least 1/3 of deaths in young people at the prime of life, unfortunately, is due to them taking their own life because of their distressed mental state. So therefore, it's a vital challenge, isn't it? And mind you, this is the age at which young people are meant to be at their most vigorous, health-wise, energetically, physically, intellectually. And therefore, it's a paradox that although it's the most vigorous age of life, it's also the peak age for onset of mental illnesses that trouble adults later in life. Particularly mental illnesses and substance use disorders have their onset before the age of 24, at least in 75% of cases. And in 50% of cases, certainly by early adolescence. So what are we talking about in terms of specific mental health difficulties? And I'm going to explain these a little later as well. Well, the main groups of disorders are depressive disorders or disorders of our mood and how we feel, basically sadness. Also, anxiety. Now, anxiety is a normal emotion. We all need a bit of anxiety to perform well. But if it becomes too great, we start to dysfunction, and anxiety disorders are very common. And the third most common trouble in young people are substance misuse disorders, mainly alcohol, but also other illicit drugs. Now, just a word on that for a moment is that we know by and large that in most cases of young people who start to abuse substances and become addicted to them, there is a preceding history of depression or anxiety and emotional and behavioural difficulties before actually they started to abuse substances. So it's very important to look at these depressive and anxiety disorders in greater detail to see what we can do about them. Psychosis also has its peak onset during adolescence and young adult life. That's where people lose contact with reality and are very, very troubled while they are ill. Early treatment for psychosis is essential, but this is a less common disorder, and I won't speak about that today, although in the scheme of things, psychosis, if it becomes chronic, becomes one of the greatest and expensive burdens on mental health in human beings in general throughout the life cycle. Next slide, please. Now, mental illnesses don't have one cause. They're very complex, and they usually involve an interaction between our biology, that is our body and the way it functions, our psychology, that is our mind and how we think, and our intellectual abilities and the profile of those abilities, and the world in which we live, our social environment, our family environment, our culture, and the world in which we inhabit. So mental health or a young person's adjustment is an interaction of all of those factors. For example, we do know that our genes can predispose us to certain sorts of mental illness. For example, anxiety runs in families. So our genes play a part. Medical illness can play a part. People with chronic mental health problems, chronic medical problems may be more prone to suffer from mental health difficulties. Psychologically, our intellectual abilities can impact on our mental health. For example, if a student has a particular learning difficulty, for example, they may not be able to write properly, and that's a real condition, then that can impact on their self-esteem and they may become depressed. Social environment also plays an enormous part, particularly the family of a young person. and we're going to talk about that in other ways. In other words, mental health is complex, and in order to help young people, we need to consider all those aspects of their life and not just one of them. Next slide, please. Now, youth or adolescence occurs as part of a whole lifetime of development and developmental stages. In some other seminars, we've talked about the vital importance of early in life, in infancy and early childhood, in establishing mental health and resilience. We're not going to talk about that today, but we will talk about some of the developmental tasks for young people which they have to negotiate as they form their identity and work out who they are. The first of these is their biology, their body. Puberty is an enormous change in our bodies, the way it functions. New hormones, our body's twice as big as it used to be, sweating, our bodies smell differently, we're capable of more, we think differently. Most importantly, we have new and heightened emotions, and we start to have active sexual feelings. We start to work out who we are sexually, who we're interested in, how we can relate, and how we can relate to all of these changes that are happening to our bodies. It's a huge transition, and it's not easily negotiated for any of us. We all need help and education, and we need to understand what these changes are and that they're not abnormal. In fact, they're to be celebrated. During the time of puberty, our brain also grows. It grows at least in terms of capacity by another 25%. So we have huge and new changes in our problem-solving skills, the speed with which we can think about things, the way we reason, for example, about moral or ethical issues, about social interactions, about justice and religion, and the culture we live in. So what a big change that is too. Our identity is forming. It's a process. Our identity is facilitated by our parents and school environment, by the sort of encouragement or discouragement they give us about who we are, our increasing autonomy, and our cultural and community context. There's a lot to take in there, isn't there? It's also a time of self-esteem and self-efficacy developing. And again, that can be enhanced by safe and positive social experiences. If we are rewarded for our behaviours, if we're congratulated, if we are congratulated on attempts to achieve things, this all builds our self-esteem. Our social relationships emerge and become much more complex, particularly with the added issue of emerging sexuality and gender expression. And I needn't remind you that some young people who naturally will have a gender expression which isn't heterosexual, that they're facing increasing challenges, perhaps of prejudice and criticism and shame, which is a disaster for them if they're not getting the appropriate support and encouragement in order to become who in fact they really are. We start to think about the future. Little children don't always do that, but certainly secondary school students are thinking about, what am I going to be? Good heavens, how will I live apart from home? Can I grow up? I'd much rather be like Peter Pan and stay a child. A move to independent living is a challenging thought, although an exciting one as well. So there are lots of changes, lots of challenges, and it's very difficult for some young people to engage in healthy lifestyles. At this time of pandemic, one of the best things we can do for our mental health is to continue a healthy lifestyle, to exercise regularly, to eat an appropriate diet, to have regular health checks with our GP. And adolescence is a time when that should begin. Get used to seeing your GP, to have appropriate and regular sleep, and to use alcohol and substances in a way in which they can be managed and are appropriately used, in fact, with limitations and guidance from a caring environment, particularly school and parents. Managing stress during this developmental task for young people is also a big challenge. Next slide, please. So let's move on to some specific conditions. Anxiety is the first of these. How does a young person know that they might be anxious? Well, firstly, they might become anxious if they're separated from a familiar environment or people like their family or their school. They may become so anxious that they may start to refuse to go to school, and that's always a warning sign. They may have pervasive worries and fearfulness. They may worry about everything, the state of the world, whether their mother or father are well, all sorts of things crowd in on them. They can become restless and irritable, and that can have an impact on their concentration and schoolwork, and certainly on their relationships with others. If they become so irritable, they go off like a rocket when somebody looks sideways at them. Or they may withdraw and become timid or more shy. They can develop fears, for example, about objects or situations, like a fear of heights or fear of being in crowded places. Often there are what we call somatic symptoms: headaches, stomach pains, aches and pains, and butterflies in the stomach. Sleep is often disturbed, and that can be difficulty getting off to sleep, disturbed sleep, and troubles with nightmares. And as I mentioned, concentration can be affected, and therefore that can impact learning. Some young people can become anxious about past stresses, and so they may continue to relive these past stresses in their mind or in their behaviour. So there's a lot of symptoms that are the hallmark of anxiety in a young person. Next slide. What's the impact? Does it matter? Well, of course it does. It certainly matters because it impacts our friendships, our social adjustment, our participation in community activities, and our capacity to learn and to be an effective member of a family. And certainly anxiety has long-term impacts. We know that significant negative impacts in the long term are continuing school refusal with ultimate school failure and lowered vocational attainment in young adult life, increasing self-isolation and rejection, so the person becomes increasingly socially withdrawn, ongoing mental health problems like the development of anxiety disorders in adult life. And we know that it's one of the top burdens of disease in the community. So therefore, anxiety is a high cost to our society. Next. What causes anxiety? Well, again, as I showed earlier in that slide about multiple factors, there are multiple factors. Family and psychosocial factors can contribute. For example, if the parents are highly anxious, that can spill over onto their children. Interestingly, if parents are overprotective, sometimes we can protect our children too much from society so that they don't learn how to become independent and face society. Separation anxiety can follow. Parental depression and mental health difficulties can contribute to child anxiety. Family stress like marital conflict, which is unresolved, parental illness, and child abuse and neglect can cause anxiety in children. There's often a family history of worriers. And today, particularly of great importance, is the increase in teasing and bullying that is occurring, unfortunately, due to the misuse of social media. I mean, in a way, we're having this webinar today because of the benefits of social media, but it can also be turned against young people and make them increasingly anxious because social media bullying is 24/7. It's not just when you're at school or when you're in the playground. Next slide, thank you. What about depression? Well, depression is essentially unhappiness and depressed mood. But importantly, particularly in teenagers, it's often associated with high levels of irritability as well. The young person loses interest in their play and friends. They can lose energy or concentration. There's a deterioration in their schoolwork, loss of appetite, or sometimes no weight gain. Some young people also overeat when they're depressed. They eat for comfort. In other words, appetite is disturbed. Sleep is usually disturbed, particularly trouble falling off to sleep and early waking in the morning. The young person develops thoughts of worthlessness, and that can lead to suicidal ideas. Certainly suicide attempts are rare before 10, but after the age of 10, they do increase, and I've talked about that before. The young person who's depressed can have somatic complaints such as headaches as well. Often depression occurs together with other mental health problems such as anxiety or difficulty concentrating or eating disorders or substance abuse. And the young person certainly has low self-efficacy. They don't believe they can find solutions to their problems. Next slide, please. There are also family and psychosocial factors which contribute. Family stress contributes. Loneliness is a big factor. At least 1 in 3 young people are reporting that they're feeling lonely these days, and even more now with COVID. Bullying is a big factor because that attacks a person's self-esteem. Repeated experience of criticism or of failure contributes to depression. And if we think about the school situation, we can easily see how if a student is in a school environment in which their work is criticised unduly, and they develop a sense of failure because the teacher unfortunately isn't working on building up their self-esteem, then that contributes to depression. Family history of depression is also salient as a genetic factor and environmental factor. Next slide, please. What's the outcome? Well, unfortunately, it's a warning sign for future mental health difficulties. In studies that we did, we found that children who suffered from depression, 72% of them had a recurrence within 5 years. Another study showed that adolescents who were depressed, around 69% had a recurrence in 7 years. So in other words, if a young person is depressed, it's a sign that they need help, and it's a sign that they probably should get into a regular relationship with their family doctor so that they can always know where to turn if unfortunately they have another episode of depression. Next slide, please. So what are the helpful responses? If you find someone's depressed, what can we do in society to make sure that we can counteract depression and anxiety? Certainly, if we provide for young people structure, routine and predictability, and of course with COVID, predictability isn't that predictable. So there's another stress, but schools can provide structure and routine. We can limit unnecessary changes, but be aware they will occur and prepare for transitions. In other words, prepare for a change of a young person from year 7 to year 8, or from year 12 to post-school options. We can remove or modify environmental stresses that upset or confuse young people, and they'll tell you about those. We must tackle bullying and provide an assurance of safety, and this has got to come from the top in schools and in society and in families. Bullying is a no-no, and it means we have to come up with better ways of tackling online or media bullying. This is a family matter, and there are some good programs now that are helping advise families how to deal with this. We should be thinking all the time about how we provide pleasant activities that promote social contact and match ability and interest. No good providing a pleasant activity that the young person is not yet capable of doing. Provide safe choices to be either quiet or in companionship. Promote a healthy diet, exercise and sleep. Always reward achievement. If a young person at school attempts the project and does the best they can, they should get complimented for that. In other words, promote self-esteem. If the young person is depressed or anxious and it's beyond and needs help, then we should facilitate contact with mental health services like the family doctor's very important, or Headspace, or community counselling services. Treatment for youth depression is really effective. Next slide, please. So why don't young people seek help sometimes? Well, there's a lot of reasons, and it's got to do with their growing independence. They may fear loss of control, and they also worry about breaches in confidentiality, that perhaps their friends will find out or something like that. There still is, unfortunately, stigma and embarrassment associated with mental health difficulties. We also have problems recognising the symptoms, and we call that mental health literacy. And I hope today I've been contributing to improving your mental health literacy. Young people can have problems managing and feeling trapped by social media. We should be finding answers to that. Young people also have an age-appropriate preference for self-reliance, and we need to encourage that. There's also a fear of failure. If I admit that I'm depressed, perhaps I won't be allowed to complete my Year 10 exams, or perhaps I won't be allowed to go on to university, or perhaps I won't be allowed to join the football team. These are realistic fears, and we need to encourage young people to realise that they are actually unfounded. Next slide. There are some strategies schools and employers can do to improve the mental health of young people, particularly around providing mental health literacy, both to staff and to students, to making provision in learning to allow for mental health difficulties, and to provide programs that are designed to reduce stigma. Next slide, please. Now, finally, if you meet a young person with a mental health problem, or if you're a young person yourself and you have a friend who's got a mental health problem, how do you respond to them? Well, firstly, be supportive and empathic. Importantly, at that time, don't share your own problems. It doesn't really help a young person who's depressed to say, oh, yes, I've been there and so forth. I know exactly how you feel and all the rest. Don't be judgmental. It's not their fault. They shouldn't be criticised for the fact that they're not feeling well. Most importantly of all, try to listen rather than give advice. And it's very hard sometimes to listen. Tell me more about it. Let me understand it better. Tell me what you meant by that. Ask the person how you can help and who else might need to know. Is there any way I can help you? Now, you've been telling me how worried you're feeling. Does anybody need to know about that? Consider reasonable modifications to workload and study stress and compensate for any disability, for example, like a specific writing difficulty. Those students need to be able to use keyboards to write, or even a scribe or voice recognition software. Provide information on where help is available. Encourage contact and support from family and the friendship group. And certainly, if somebody says they would rather be dead and give ideas of suicide, then that must be taken seriously. And they need help to contact student health services, their GP or a crisis service. Remember, ultimately, that you're not the therapist, but you can be the best of supports. Next slide, thank you. Next slide. And next slide. It looks like we've gone into another talk. Next slide. If you can go right to the end now, thank you. My final comments before the Q&A is that if any of you have been feeling troubled by what I've been talking about or would like some help, don't forget help is available. And you can get help by, for example, phoning or contacting our Mental Health Foundation Australia helpline, or Lifeline, or Kids Help, or certainly going to your GP or family doctor or the Headspace clinic or your community health centre in your locality. Thank you very much.